What is a generation, and is it useful to categorize different people in that way?
Well, generation is one of those concepts that is really, really annoying. So I always have this tension because I work with this concept. On the one hand, I think it's overused and often sort of useless. I mean, it means broadly two things. There's a sort of a vertical meaning to generation. So families, fathers, sons, that kind of thing, 5 generations in a family. And then there's a horizontal meaning. So cohorts, peer groups. And often when people talk about generations, for example, they use labels like baby boomers, millennials, whatever. It refers to what sociologists call social generations. So cohorts of people, but who are sort of grouped together by a particular kind of historical experience, a moment in time. So it's got these two meanings, and it is useful. In the sense of, obviously the biological familial meaning of generation is fairly straightforward. And I think that's a useful kind of grounding in our past, present and future. The sort of lateral social meaning is, I think it just needs to be handled with care, because I think what it tells us is something about the experience of having lived through the same time at roughly the same age, which impacts on us, right? And also we impact on the moment. The trouble is it's overused by media, marketers. It's often jumbled up and used interchangeably. So you have people talking about generation, age, they kind of mush all of these things up together. And it can be used wrongly to just flatten out all the other experiences. So we know that not everyone your age, right, thinks the same way, or has the same location in class or gender or any of these things, So the idea that it's just like Gen Z is like this or the baby boomers are like that is obviously a nonsense. So it's trying to untangle those things.
Well, it seems to me to be a product, especially in recent years, of social media and the news cycle, and being able to very neatly categorize things and not have to do much critical thinking. How long have you been studying generations, and how have you seen the use of the word generation develop over time?
I have been studying generations properly since I began my PhD in 2010. I was interested, when I began my PhD, I was actually interested in the question of intergenerational solidarity and the relationship between adults and children in the community. I've been working previously on parenting culture and on particularly on the vetting and barring scheme, a kind of a licensing scheme to check that people who wanted to run youth football groups weren't paedophiles, that kind of thing. And I'd been very interested in the formalisation of those relationships and some of the problems with that. But I started looking at it and I realised that there was this thing called generation that was being increasingly kind of talked about. And in particular, the baby boomer generation at the time was being talked about everywhere. It was talked about a lot in the newspapers. There were a number of books in 2010, including David Willits's book, The Pinch, How the Baby Boomers Stole Their Children's Future and Why They Should Give It Back. And then there were a few others coming from slightly different political perspectives. David Willits was a Conservative minister, and then there were left-wing versions of that, and there were young versions of that, and the baby boomers were just getting a real kicking. And so I started looking into it and realised that there'd been this interest in specifically the baby boomer generation for quite a long time, but particularly since really the 1990s, where it seemed that old ways of making sense of the world politically, the old divisions weren't really as easy to work with for commentators. Do you know what I mean? So they found it easier to talk about supposed divisions between generations rather than between social classes or between left and right or whatever. So you're right in the sense that when it really took off was a product of that sort of depoliticisation of the 1990s, which all then came kind of flooding out, in the early noughties in this ridiculous claim that the baby boomers were responsible for everything bad that had ever happened in the world.
Let's break this down. Can you first of all outline when each generation actually is in terms of the years that they were born? And then it would be great to go through what we get wrong with each generation.
Okay. I was hoping you wouldn't ask me this question because, no, partly because my head for numbers is not the best, but also because part of the problem with generations, the concept of these social generations, is that everyone measures them differently. So the birth dates. So this is what's one of the things that's very weird about this discussion. You get this idea that, for example, there are this many baby boomers having to be paid for by this many Gen Xers, and that's a real problem. But when you look at the birth cohorts, they're often defined quite differently. I mean, the baby boomers, largely, people talk about 1947 to 1964, although sometimes 1945 to 1965. They're the obvious ones, because that was a demographic fact that happened after the end of the Second World War. People came back from the war and got busy making babies, essentially, and there was a boom in the birth rate. Although, interestingly, it was much bigger in America than it was in Britain. So the concept was sort of smuggled in from America.
Why is that?
Well, I think it's probably related to the other meaning of the baby boomer, which is the economic boom, the post-war boom. And I remember, I think it was P.J. O'Rourke, the satirist, who kind of quipped that Britain had the war and America had the post-war boom. I mean, people often forget that for, at least 10 years after the war in Britain, it was still a very grey, poor, depressing place. There was still rationing and everything else. So it wasn't the same. We were quite battered. America obviously hadn't been in the war in that way. And, it was a very open country. There'd been lots of, refugees going to America. It was, there was a real optimism and economic dynamism in America that was very apparent from the 50s going through to the 60s. So I think that's part of the reason. But also pattern. I mean, you can see a version of the baby boom throughout Western Europe after the war, but it does vary. Now, these phenomena are never. It might be a pattern, but it's not the same kind of pattern.
Okay, baby boomers. What comes next?
Oh, right. So the baby boomers. Then you have Gen X. So if you were to say like baby boomers, say for simplicity, 1947, 1964, then Gen X, 1965 through to the end of the 1970s. Now, that's my generation. We were very small. So after the baby boom comes actually the baby bust, which is largely demographically, it's attached to, explained partly through the development of the contraceptive pill. Excuse me. And so women could control their fertility. And so in a way, you had a bit of a delay in people then having babies. And you also started to have a sort of trend towards smaller families and all of that. But also that's the way demography tends to go. You have ups, downs and whatever. But so the Gen X was quite small. And it was also the generation that came of age in the 70s and the early 80s. So it was a very different moment. Whereas the baby boomers are thought of often as the 60s generation, and they came of age, it's like flower power and peace, love and everything, great music. Gen X, like with Thatcher's children and, a recession and, it was Cold War misery and economic problems. So Gen X has never been very popular. After Gen X, you got the Millennials. And it's quite interesting that the discussion about the Millennials at the time, so that they are people who were sort of, the cohort roughly runs from those who would come of age around the millennium or kind of were born kind of near the millennium. But the whole noise around the Millennials was like, yes, these kids are going to save us, There were more of them because they're also called the Boomer Echo, the children of the baby boomers. You see how imprecise all of this stuff, it doesn't match up because I'm Gen X, my parents were baby boomers, so, whatever. And they were seen as this kind of happy, shiny 90s. It was like the Cold War had ended. There was the tech bubble. There was lots of money sloshing around. La, la, la. That was all a happy story. They were supposed to save us. But then we had 9/11. It's a big social shock. And then the global financial crisis. So with the millennials, like any generation, if you're going to measure something over about 20 years, you have the ones who reap the benefits of the shiny happy days, and then the ones who were then kind of talked about as really being battered by the global financial crisis. So that was the millennials, who were originally called Gen Y, but then the term millennial get caught on it, only because it comes after Gen X.
So they're technically still Gen Y.
Yeah, it's the same, roughly the same thing. But again, the labels differ depending on who wants to come up with the label first or which one they prefer and everything else. But it's all quite unimaginative. I mean, Gen X interests me because part of the reason it's called Gen X, I think, is after a novel by the Canadian novelist Douglas Coupland called Gen X. I think it was Tales for an Accelerated Culture or something like that. It's a great novel, very zeitgeisty, but it was about the sort of drifty, cynical aimlessness associated with my generation. So you think this shows how imagined a lot of this stuff is, that catches on because it's actually a novel.
It's interesting that they were termed as the aimless generation at the time, and now you've got Gen Z being described as lazy and, lacking any meaning and purpose.
I know, poor old Gen Z. And coming right at the end of the alphabet as well.
Is that because we're the last humans to exist before the planet dies?
I don't think so. I think it's just that no one's agreed on what the next version will it be the COVID generation. Jean Twenge, who's a very influential social psychologist on generations, came up with the term iGen, but it didn't really catch on, so
but they're next up after the millennials.
They're next up. And yes, and it is interesting that a lot of the stuff that was said about Gen Z before COVID is very reminiscent of the stuff that was said about Gen X, So it's lazy, as you say. It's like, they're hard-bitten and nihilistic and, miserable and blah, blah, blah. That's because they're the children of their hard-bitten and nihilistic parents.
Yeah, well, let's get onto that. Before we get to Gen Z, let's take it back now that we've given that context and we've laid out the history. What do people get wrong about the baby boomer generation?
Oh, many things. Well, what people get wrong about it is a number of things. So, first of all, that it's like one great big block of people, as I said, you get this term that really kind of gets developed in America and then it gets plonked onto Britain. Quite a different demographic and cultural context. Some similarities, obviously.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask you. Judging from what you've said so far, it seems that these definitions are essentially coined by sociologists to fit into their narratives to a certain extent, and they'll stretch them to tailor to fit to what they're saying. So do the generations change depending on where you go in the world? For example, baby boomers in America, what if you go over to China where there maybe wasn't a boom in that time? Are they still referred to as baby boomers?
Well, they shouldn't be. Actually, Karl Mannheim, who's the father of the sociology of generations, he was writing in the 1920s, made this point, actually using the comparison of China, saying, people in the same, to be a part of a generation, you have to be in the same kind of time period, but also geographical location. He was very, very hot on needing to share that experience, and obviously Chinese peasants, as he talked about at the time, were in a very different position to, for example, young German people. So, I should say it's not really sociologists' fault. I mean, a lot of this kind of generation chatter comes from marketing, actually. And part of the problem is that it gets then taken really seriously by journalists and academics and everything else. So this is the part of my brain that says this is all nonsense. Really, why am I studying this? Because it is all nonsense. There is the sociology of generations, which is more serious. But that's another thing. So you get these kind of things, these like cool things that are supposed to capture stuff, which then people take as though they're real rather than cultural constructs.
So we've got this sort of floating generation of baby boomers where there's a broad range of when they were born, but we can agree on the rough dates. What are the misconceptions about the baby boomers?
So the kind of narrative of the baby boomer, or what I call the cultural script of boomer blaming, is that they're all really rich. That's not true. Like any generation, it's varied. They've all got these fantastic pensions. Well, because of the economic and social circumstances, some of them, yes, did end up with really good pension schemes and quite a nice retirement, but it was only a section of them, and we have to remember that the younger half of the baby boom was also really more of a product of the 70s than it was of the 60s. So the time, which was a time of real economic difficulty and social pessimism and everything else, and has been kind of clobbered by changes to pension schemes and all manner of things afterwards. So there's that sort of mistake. The biggest problem, the biggest claim about the baby boomers, which is a real problem, is this idea that they kind of caused all of the economic and social problems as though it was a matter of policy. So it's an idea that this generation, it's like these millions of people from quite different circumstances, as though they're the ones who made policy decisions. And so there's this claim that, well, the baby boomers, they kind of took the best from the welfare state and then they pulled up the ladder behind them so no one else, as though they weren't in charge, politicians were in charge. And actually some of these weren't policy decisions, they were economic circumstances and everything else. So there's this kind of weird attempt to paint the baby boomers as this homogenous block of greedy, selfish people who've got this wish to take everything away from the young, which is just palpably untrue. It's an absolute nonsense. But in 2010, when I was beginning to write about it, it was everywhere, this claim.
Gen X, biggest misconceptions.
Interesting. I think I'm probably a bit too close to Gen X to comment on it. I mean, I think there's always a truth in what, the stereotypes. I think Gen X, there is a truth to this notion that we're a bit kind of hard bitten and kind of cynical because of the times that we grew up in. And there was that sense of, we were sort of a bit rebellious. I think that there's a real kind of, I suppose the biggest misconception that is now becoming more widely aired is that we're all really bitter. We're all it's like we're as bad as the baby boomers, only there's fewer of us. And so that's the sort of Gen X is being brought into the frame as we get older, because a lot of this discussion is also really influenced by ageism, the idea that old people are the problem. And as we enter our middle ages, it's you're really bad too. And I think there is a thing about Gen X where I think there is a sort of realism, cynicism, everything else. But I don't think there's I don't think there's a sort of bitter hatred of everybody else in the way that it's often painted.
Yeah, well, I guess everything changes depending on how old you are. So actually what gets mapped onto Gen X as a typical Gen X trait is something that will later be mapped onto Gen Z once they reach that age. So you tell me, what do you think are some of the best ways to actually distinguish a generation? Is it maybe something like the inventions during their lifetime, things that fundamentally change the way they interact with the world, but that don't change as they age?
Yes. So what you're getting to there is one of the quite complicated things about generation theory, which is the need to distinguish between age effects and cohort effects and generation effects, or historical period effects. My thinking around this is very influenced by Karl Mannheim's work on the problem of generations, and he very much talks about the temporal historical period effects. So the things that give rise to a particular zeitgeist, which then is taken on board and shaped by people. We carry the spirit of our age in a way. And then, obviously we don't all do that in the same way, and then you have to break it down and everything else. So for me, that's the most useful way in thinking about these generation labels. But we have to be very careful, because if it becomes so overwhelming as an explanation, and this is, for example, part of the problem with the idea of the COVID generation, it can end up as sort of deterministic. As people who say, for example, the millennials were shaped by the global financial crisis, or Jean Twenge, who has got a load of insights. I really, really like her work. But she's a psychologist, not a sociologist, so we differ on that. But, she tries to periodise it through technology, for example. And you think, well, that's interesting, but why use technology rather than history? I would use history, as a way of looking at those kind of periodizations.
Well, there's this classic thing in all families, including mine, where your dad will go, oh, you're this, you're that, because of your generation. Yeah. And he's mapping on a set of characteristics that I do fear can be very deterministic. And I guess the question is, how much do you want to label each generation without restricting what they go on to do? And maybe you could say that the onus is on the individual person to not let a pathetic label impact their life. But at first glance, I'd say that it does pretty heavily. And what you label a generation as is going to impact the way they interact with the older generations and the older generations interact with them.
Well, again, you've hit on something really important within generation theory. So if you look at Mannheim, he was writing about the meaning of generations within the sociology of knowledge. So it was about the way in which generations of people, or cohorts of people, shall we say, came to kind of understand the world that they were living in, and then came to sort of show the developed a generational consciousness. And he didn't say this happens all the time, right? He didn't say it just happens every 20 years in this like ridiculous way that is now talked about. He was talking about he was writing in the interwar period. And, so if you think about, for example, the First World War generation, the people who came to embody the First World War generation were the poets, Wilfred Owen and, Siegfried Sassoon, and that sort of bleak sense of disenchantment with the old order. Now, the important thing is that understanding of the First World War generation and their voice came out of what they actually said. It wasn't done in advance of them saying it. Actually, it's similar with the baby boomers, that the insights about the baby boomer generation came from what they said and what they did and all the things that they were associated with them when they came to young adulthood. And they too were the product of a massive social and cultural shift. I mean, a cultural revolution, some people call it, of the 60s. So that's what gave rise to them. What we've had sort of since then, as the generation chatter became more influential, is an attempt to construct in advance what generations are going to be like. And that's a completely different thing, and it is very dangerous for the reasons that you say. Everything becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, I have a sneaky suspicion that it does. Yeah. And that's why I've started this show, The Next Generation. And this is a horrible question to ask you, sat at the opposite end of the table to me. But do you think there's merit in the idea that if we actually flip it and say that, yeah, Gen Z are struggling and they've got certain issues that they're facing, they've got the best circumstances they could possibly have to flourish, that's effective enough to almost set off this domino effect where we start believing it and the way our generation is characterized shifts in a major way?
I think, I wouldn't go as far as that, because I think, the circumstances in which Gen Z is reaching adulthood are very kind of complicated and confusing. However, where I completely agree with you is that there's an openness here that we haven't seen, in my view, since the baby boom. Okay, so we and this is where COVID comes in and all the things that led to the lockdowns and then what we're seeing now with the kind of outbreak of, populism and the move away from the established media. And, it's like the conventions that have held things together since the 1990s are just crumbling everywhere. And so this is a great opportunity. Yes, it's disturbing, it's confusing and everything else, but there is something in which, with Gen Z, we have a group of young adults that can properly find its voice in a kind of authentic way. And, also kind of, this is something that I'm thinking about at the moment, so I may be wrong on it, but I think, there's something about being able to kind of navigate and ride the contradictions of the moment.
What do you mean by that?
In my experience, the sort of people your age, this is late teens, early 20s, my students, everything else, they're not like the caricatures of, they don't go, we're not going to discuss that. They're not perpetually offended. They're not, when you talk to them in person, but what they are doing is that they're kind of able to sort of pick up and run with quite a lot of ideas concurrently.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're not, you know, like in the general election, they're not, you know, they're not wedded to the Labour Party. They're not anti the Labour Party. They might votingly grudgingly vote for the Labour Party because they want to do that. But it's very different to, you know, previous years when I was teaching Millennials. And I don't know if this makes sense. But I think that the fact is we are living in a contested, contradictory moment where everything is up for grabs. And I think you guys, partly because your formative years were taken up for grabs because of the lockdowns, it's almost like you seem to be able to kind of balance that and navigate that in a way that I think those of us who, for example, were really shocked by the lockdowns because it was nothing we'd ever known and everything else. We just sort of contrast now to, you know, the past in a more linear way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I guess how much that... I wonder how much that maps onto other events. If we were to get hit by a war, for example, if Gen Z would be really good at reacting to the adversity faced, and, you know, we have to go into bunkers to hide from bombs coming in, but we're used to it because we've been locked down anyway. Do you think there's something in...
But you might not fight for your country.
Well, this is the problem, isn't it?
This is the problem.
Do you think... Would you estimate that Gen Z will be better in the future at dealing with adversity?
I mean, I don't know, to be honest. I think it's an open question. I think we certainly shouldn't say that it will be worse. I think there are some troubling indicators about, you know, teenagers and young adults to do with, whether it's discussions about the massive load of school absenteeism or economic inactivity rates or rates of quite serious mental health illness. You know, so I don't think you're all fine in that way. And I think there is as a society, when we really, really screwed up socialising young people during COVID as a society. That's what we did. And that has consequences, right? Not irredeemable ones, but I don't really see adult society getting back on it and saying, right, okay, we're going to make this right. I see them all trying to kind of pick up where we left off and go, oh, please come to school. You know, so I think, we have to be a bit careful. But I also really hate the narrative that says, oh, everyone was irredeemably damaged by COVID. We can't fix it. So what we need to do now is look at 3-year-olds and hope that we make a better job with them. Instead of writing off an entire generation.
But what do you think we got wrong with socialisation during COVID, and how do we fix it?
We closed the schools. We should never have done that. We closed the universities as well. So we basically saw both education as being unimportant, which I think if you're in a social crisis, and it was a social crisis, it was obviously a public health crisis, but if you're in a social crisis, you know, you see education as more important than ever because that's your link with the past. That's how you give young people the tools to understand their world. And also in terms of providing spaces for young people to be with each other and, social spaces, we just kind of got rid of those quite cruelly and for quite a long time. And I think we also, not when I say we, I don't mean like all of us, but, adults in general, particularly middle-aged adults, I would say, not the very old, not young adults, were very trying to protect ourselves from the young people. So there's a lot of really nasty narrative about young people spreading germs and all of that, as though they're just vectors of, and you think, my God, it's like, that's like... and it was coming from the section of society that actually, in terms of being at risk from the disease, wasn't the most heavily at risk. So it was a very odd moment. But that's what I think happened. And that's why I've written quite a lot about the impact of school closures. Because however many problems there are, we know school's not perfect and all the rest of it. I think, symbolically and in terms of the everyday reality, I think it sent out a huge signal that, when push comes to shove, actually, we'll just give up on that bit of what we do as a society.
Well, the interesting flip is that it seems to me like during COVID, it obviously was the case that the older generations were prioritized, and that was based off of the fact that they're more susceptible to dying if they do get COVID. But actually, if you look back at something like the Titanic and who gets put on the lifeboats, it's not the old people, it's the kids and the women. And without getting down a rabbit hole about why the women get put on there, it's the kids, it's the next generation. Do you feel like there's been a flip in prioritization where actually the older are prioritized more than nurturing this up and coming generation that's ultimately going to be the ones running the show in a few years' time?
No, I don't feel like that. But I mean, I have to say, when the lockdowns first happened, and I was so horrified by the way the whole thing went, I did have that horrible existential moment where you think, has my last 10 years of research been in vain? Maybe it wasn't quite 10 years, but when I'm thinking, I've written all of this stuff about the problem of blaming old people and having a go at old people and ageism. And then now I'm looking at how terribly young people are being treated. I'm thinking, did I get it wrong? And I obviously thought about it, wrote about it a lot, watched the whole thing play out. And I, genuinely came to the conclusion that what was driving this wasn't an old versus young thing. I mean, the old people, the ones who are really at risk from COVID, weren't protected, actually. I mean, look at what happened in care homes. I mean, even the ones that weren't in care homes, the idea that you basically, you care best for your elderly by staying away from them. I mean, I could sort of see the logic on one level, but what it did in terms of, loneliness and the lack of kind of general kind of care, and the shutdown of like large parts of the health service, which impacted mainly on old people. So it was a government narrative that the lockdowns are for the benefit of the elderly, but that was a smokescreen. I mean, that wasn't really what was going on. What the lockdowns, or who the lockdowns protected, were middle class professionals. And you may have seen that joke that circulated at some point. Yeah, there wasn't any lockdown. There were just middle class people hiding in their homes while working class people brought them things. I mean, that's what happened. And young work. Yeah, it's like you'd see young workers. They were all, my students included, they were all working in the supermarkets, keeping the whole show on the road, and then told they couldn't go to the pub, and blamed for going to the odd party as though this was going to cause devastation. But when you look at what happened, it was middle class society kind of retracting in on itself. And I think that's a much more useful frame for understanding it than looking at it as a sort of old versus young thing.
Do you think you're falling prey to actually the fact that we're able to map on logic to the lockdowns now that they've happened, but it's actually one of those events, Nassim Nicholas Taleb has a book, The Black Swan, that you just can't prepare for? You can prepare in certain ways, but ultimately you can't predict that it's coming along. Is there any truth in that, or are there certain ways that you can prepare for these devastating events, and no matter what they are, be ready at least more than you were for something like COVID?
Yes and no, I think. I mean, one of the things that most shocked me about the lockdowns was precisely that, that this kind of intervention had never happened. Everyone kept saying it's unprecedented.
Yeah, that was the buzzword.
Yeah. And it's like, well, a pandemic, a novel respiratory virus, a pandemic is not unprecedented. We've not had one for a long time. I think Johnson said it was a once in a generation thing. But as a society, over history, we have dealt with these horrible outbreaks of infectious diseases. And in that context, yes, you do have to do things that are nasty, right? I mean, there's like quarantining of sick people and all of this stuff, which isn't, might not sit well with one's libertarian tendencies, but, I think it's justifiable sometimes. I mean, you can't run public health by referendum, right? The state, as the embodiment of the people, needs to act. Generally, that's how it goes. But what hadn't ever been done before was this mass kind of locking down of healthy people, and this kind of idea that it would be okay. And I think that was the thing that was really interesting, because it was there was this like very weirdly selective view of reality that, well, because we've got social media, which, by the way, as a parent, we've been told for years and years and years, keep your kids away from social media. It's really bad. Lockdown's like, oh, it's fine. They've got Zoom. Yeah. We've got social media and we've got Amazon, as though Amazon parcels deliver themselves. We can just do this and we can pretend like we are, and I don't think it was pre-planned, but there was something very reckless in that idea that we just suddenly departed from everything that we'd ever done before as societies. Or, people have whole careers where they think about how to manage infectious diseases. We moved away from all that to just do this new thing on a wing and a prayer that it might work. And I think that was dangerous. I think we can say, well, we shouldn't do that again, right? We should learn the lessons. But I do also agree with you in the sense that the way that societies responded to COVID is more like it's a product of the very febrile general situation we find ourselves in. So we can't be sure that it's like, how would we respond to a war, for example? I don't think anyone really knows. I suspect not very well right now, but.
Have we always had leaders and idols that flip-flop on policy and what they say as long as it best fits them, or is this more of a new phenomenon?
I think politicians have always been fallible, but I think it's a product of the gap between the kind of political and cultural elites and the people. And that's why, that whole kind of the way that things went during the lockdowns with the flip-flopping, this sort of idea that if you make things look right on a spreadsheet, that's going to work with society.
It's making things look good rather than actually doing good.
Yeah, but it's not knowing what to do because, if you're a politician, you're supposed to be the representative of the people, the embodiment of the people. And, and actually the Johnson election in 2019, I mean, it was a huge landslide and vote of confidence in that administration. So it was supposed to carry that sense of, we are representing the country. But, it was the product of quite a long time of this gap widening between, sort of Parliament and the people. And I think that's why now we're seeing this populist moment everywhere, because the electorate are just realising that the people in charge don't know what they think and can't represent their interests. And then the people in charge are failing because they've got nothing behind them. Because if they just sit around talking to each other, they're never going to come up with any sensible policy. I mean, I'm amazed by the number of policy announcements that get made and then immediately kind of withdrawn. Yeah. But it's like, why didn't you check? And it's almost like they can't work out in advance what might work or not.
Well, this is what I'm alluding to. I see it constantly, all these new policies announced that then disappear without a trace the next week. What is that product between these elitists and the people? What is that gap between elitists and these people a product of?
Well, a number of things. So, I mean, I should say it's not all their fault. It's easy to kind of say, oh, the problem is Boris, let's get rid of Boris. Well, we went through all of this, didn't we? And then we had all these other people. And then it's like, the problem is the Conservatives, let's have the Labour Party. Oh, how's that going? And we're seeing kind of more extreme manifestations of this everywhere else, obviously. I think it's the product of a long period of depoliticisation.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, essentially, from the Second World War until the 1990s, there was a sort of, relatively stable kind of confrontation between the left and the right, and the project of the left was sort of backed up by the existence of the Soviet Union, and the project of the right was backed up by all the failings that were the failings of the Soviet Union, so it was the Soviet Union kind of just made it really obvious why freedom and having stuff and all of that was a really good thing. And then all that kind of crumbled. And then in the 1990s, when the Berlin Wall came down, and then the Cold War ended, and Francis Fukuyama wrote that very influential book called The End of History, basically saying, right, so this has been established that liberal democracy is, the system. And Margaret Thatcher came up with this formulation, TINA, people call it, there is no alternative to the market. And it was like a victory for kind of capitalism, really, over communism, victory for the right in one sense, but it also really exposed the hollowness of their ideas. And it meant, when you're trying to kind of justify something without having anything to justify it against, people see the limitations of it. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And also the right at that time was very much the sort of market right. There wasn't really the conservative sort of thing. The idea of holding on to some of the gains of the past had kind of gone, really. So you had this sort of freewheeling, what we in academia like to call neoliberal, which obviously means like 60 million things as well. It's worse than the concept of generation. But anyway, that's, everyone was playing that same game, So Margaret Thatcher famously said that her greatest achievement was Tony Blair, that sort of, that move towards the centre. And this managerial style politics, as though people used to talk about UK PLC. This is bringing it all back now, as though the UK was a company and Tony Blair's the CEO. And what mattered was kind of good management. So that's kind of where you get to the depoliticisation, and you started to see, quite significant falls in voter turnout and real falling membership of the political parties. But people just didn't have anywhere where to go, and it was a sort of time of, okay, this isn't great, but it's all right. It was a very non-idealistic time. Anyway, and that was the sort of 90s and then the noughties. And then, 9/11 was one big kind of wake up call that maybe, Western democracies couldn't just coast, that there were dangers out there. We couldn't just say, oh, right, okay, the world will be a peaceful market, happy place, because actually it's more complicated than that. And then the global financial crisis was a wake up call to the problems of, the market at the time. And, which itself was a consequence of some really significant economic kind of problems and stagnation really stretching back to the 1970s. So you have all of that context. Is this making sense?
Absolutely. But to follow on what you're saying, it seems to me like there were those reactions to 9/11 and the financial crash, but it doesn't feel like we've changed much since the big COVID incident. So why do you think that is? That people react to all these black swan events that happen in history, but it feels to me at least like we haven't reacted against the most important things we could have taken from COVID and the lockdowns. I don't know if you agree with that.
Well, it depends what you mean by we, because I think you're right on the level of the elites. You got this ridiculous COVID inquiry, just spending more and more and more money, and whatever. It's not going to achieve anything or resolve anything. Those are lessons learned. And amongst that kind of the political and cultural elites, you have this, I think there is just still this sense of, if we just put our fingers in our ears and carry on like doing what we were doing, we'll get back to 2010 again, I think no one's optimistic enough that we can go back pre-financial crisis. But you see this at universities as well. And you might know the university sector's in a massive state of crisis because of all manner of things that have been a problem for, going on for 20 years. And no one knows what to do about it. So there's that it's that kind of like magical thinking that we saw a lot of during COVID. So I think that's the problem, that there's a reluctance to confront all of this stuff on the elite level because no one's got a solution to it. But on the ground, I think there's massive changes. And I think this is what you're seeing in, populist politics, I mean, on whatever side of the political spectrum they come from. I mean, it's just happening everywhere. And there's been an attempt to sort of make out that things are just a blip. You know, oh, Brexit, that was just a mistake. And then Trump, oh, that shouldn't have happened. And, you know, oh, you know, France. And then, but now it's happening all the time, and it's happening again and again and again. And what that's showing is that people are responding to all of these events that have happened and saying, well, no, actually, we want more representation. We want our concerns to be taken seriously, you know. And I think that's actually quite exciting. It's unnerving because we haven't seen politics. I mean, in my lifetime, I would say I haven't really seen politics. I mean, I was like I said, my maths isn't great. But, you know, my entire childhood was the Thatcher years. And then, you know, when I went to university and everything, it was the early 90s, which was pretty grim. And then it was Blair. So my whole growing up was a product of sort of depoliticisation. And then seeing this now, you think, oh, but it's interesting.
You're probably going to hate this question, but I think you are the perfect person to answer it. There's a meme that floats around the internet 24/7, and it's that weak men create bad times create strong men create good times create weak men, and the cycle keeps on going around. It's sort of this generational meme.
Okay.
How much truth do you think there is to that?
Yeah, it's nonsense, isn't it? I think, if I understood what you said. I mean, another element of generation theory, one that I don't buy, but it's been quite influential, is there's a sort of a cyclical version of generation theory. And this is partly what led to the idea that the millennials will save us. There's these commentators in the States, Neil Howe and William Strauss, who've written a lot about generations.
Yeah.
And they wrote a book called kind of Millennials Rising, and they wrote something else called The Fourth Turning of Prophecy. And they seek to look into the future, this cyclical approach. And it's almost biblical, and it's very odd. You know, when you read the stuff that they've said about the past generations, obviously they've got insights because they're looking at, you know, characteristics. But how you can read history forwards, I find it very, very strange. This is why I my pet loathing at the moment is that phrase, being on the right side of history. It's like, what does it mean? And how do you know? And you know, history doesn't work like that. You don't just jump to the right side somewhere in the future. It's a very, very dynamic process. I don't think we've had good times. I mean, I don't think, you know, I think that you know, there's a tendency to look at the instability now and then to hark back to particularly the 1990s. People now talk about the 1990s as though it was like the 60s. It's like some kind of exciting nirvana. It really wasn't. It was very dull. And, you know, although most of the money was like finance capital, it wasn't real money. It wasn't, you know, proper wealth or, you know, forward looking. So I think, I think we just need people to rise to the occasion, really, and to be prepared to have a lot of arguments out, because what's certainly true is that fragmented times lead to lots of different positions and contestations and everything else. And, you know, there's some big fights ahead, but fights can sometimes achieve things.
Okay, millennials, biggest misconceptions.
Millennials, oh my God. Right. Well, the biggest misconception about the millennials is that they would always be young. I mean, poor millennials. You know, the whole script of boomer blaming was based on the kind of idea that the millennials were the victims of the baby boomers. And everyone took pity on the millennials because they were, you know, young. Obviously, then they got a bit older. So the poor old millennials are now getting completely trashed because it's like, well, we should be thinking about Gen Z instead. And look at you, like, actually, you're entitled. There's loads of you. You had a bit of nice time, you know. I think so, yeah. So that's the biggest misconception about them, I think.
I asked a question to your Battle of Ideas panel this year, and it was essentially saying that people blame Gen Z a lot of the time for all these woke policies, having safe spaces everywhere and being forced to use someone's pronouns. But actually, people who are my age, 19, aren't the ones in power, aren't the ones running the institutions. It's the millennials and older. but especially the millennials, I think, in terms of bringing in these policies. Would you agree with that actually you can lay a bit of a blame finger on these millennials? I'm treading very carefully because I feel like you disagree with this.
Well, you know, I mean, I love a bit of millennial bashing, really, but because I'm a bitter old Gen X person. I don't think they actually run the institutions, though. I think what they experienced, and Gen Z also experiences, is this whole thing about hiding behind young people to do stuff. I mean, so for institutions, for whatever reason, have, and this has been going on for quite a long time, organise themselves around this kind of, this idea of having a more regulated environment and, codes of conduct and, things like that. So you're right, it's not Gen Z calling for the pronouns, but I don't think it's the millennials. I think the millennials are brought in as sort of like youth consultants, but... And there's a few activists out there, but if you look at the way this stuff now is so ingrained, it's so institutionalised. When you have a template to put your pronouns on your official email signature, right? That's not coming from a trans activist group, right? That's coming from the people running the institution. So I think...
But why is it coming from them? Because anecdotally, which is completely fucking worthless, but I'll go ahead with it.
It's not completely worthless. It's just not empirical data.
Yes. The older people that I see, the baby boomers or whatever, a lot of them that I speak to have no idea what the fuck is going on with all of this stuff. And they just say, oh, you kids, whatever. So to me, it doesn't seem that it's them implementing these things and using millennials as a mouthpiece for their own convenience. It very much seems like it's the generation above me that have actually bought into some of this ideology and are implementing it. Whereas when I look around at Gen Z, I have a lot of faith because I don't think that we actually believe a lot of the things that we profess to believe. I think we're just sort of buying into this narrative for the sake of saving face, and it's very surface level performative for the sake of looking good on social media or in front of your friends or fear of being ostracized. Whereas I don't know if that's true with the millennials. It seems much more deep rooted and ingrained in them, and that it's going to be very hard to reason them out of that. Whereas I feel like with any Gen Z activist that I disagree with, there's more of a chance that I am going to pull them in my direction and be able to convince them with reasoning.
Yeah, I think you've got a lot of things going on there, though. I mean, I think first of all, it's not generational, this stuff. The question of why is it happening, and I don't really know the answer. But I think it comes from a sort of technocratic impulse to try and how do I put this? Sort of to try and kind of manage people as individuals through some kind of legal kind of framework, right? I mean, the effect of it is to break down existing solidarities, is to sow kind of mistrust, all of that. But, and I don't, it's not like I'm saying that everybody who implements all of this stuff has got all of this consciously going on in their head. But it's in Max Weber's terms, it's, a part of the process of rationalization of, people, where things become more and more process driven. And there's this idea that, you kind of sort people according to, whatever their characteristics are. It attempts to gain legitimacy from identity politics. And this is where, the millennials might come into play there. I mean, identity politics has got a long history. It's been developing at least since the 1970s. And I think with the millennials, I think they did, as the millennials were growing up, it had become institutionalized, that idea that you should sort of define yourself in accordance with what you thought your identity was and your characteristics and everything else. I mean, bearing in mind they were the product of that whole process of depoliticization that I was talking about. So yes, I mean, maybe it comes more naturally to millennials. And, excuse me, maybe it's, I mean, I'm loath to say this, but maybe it is also an expression of a certain type of idealism. In terms of, doing something meaningful with your life. I mean, I think that people who think that all of this stuff is kind of inclusive and, respectful and everything, I think that some of them probably really do think that. I think they're wrong. But, I mean, I don't think that the motivation behind it is fully cynical. And I think what you're describing about Gen Z is, I mean, it may be a generation effect to do with the fact that your lot are growing up in a different time where there's more questioning going on. Mm-hmm. You are less institutionalised, partly because we didn't bother to socialise you. But also it might just be because you're young. So young people generally haven't worked out their positions on things, and they're not in a position of, they haven't got any power even to influence, the kind of form of words that, I don't know, an HR department might use.
Yeah, I mean, they're heavily impacted by the institutions, right? Mm-hmm. Depending on what we're taught in our curriculum and the rest of it. How have you seen that change over the last sort of century, the way that institutions are framed?
Which kind of institutions? Do you mean educational institutions? I think, I think schools and universities have, moved further and further and further away from their educational purpose into playing a much wider role, ironically, of socialisation. The schools have always socialised children in that way. You have primary socialisation in the family and then secondary socialisation in school. And, it's about kind of, this is the world and everything. Mm. But there's been more and more emphasis on, trying to use school as a vehicle for getting young people to think about, well, not, what to think about social issues or, there's very therapeutic dimension to a lot of schooling. Think about how you are. It carves out time from the curriculum in terms of the study of the subjects, but it also it does mean that those kind of institutions are playing. I mean, I think that it's difficult balance because sensitive teachers have always looked out for the welfare of their children. I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that there's this kind of total line between the school and the family. But I think there's a blurring of domains that's been going on, again, at least since the 1990s, which was really explicitly brought in by governments wanting to blur that line. It started a bit with Thatcher on sort of marketisation and parental choice and everything else, but it was very explicitly brought in by the new Labour government that sort of imagined parents as partners in a child's education and growing up, and and really saw the school as playing that kind of role in sort of shaping children as new citizens and all of that. So I think that's a problem, and I think it does affect young people. I mean, some people call it a process of indoctrination. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not really sure if it's necessarily strong enough to actually do that, but that's certainly been the aim. And I think the millennials were part of that, that there was that sort of sense of, right, we need to teach them to think this.
Mm-hmm. Well, why is that a problem with schools playing a heavier hand in the child's upbringing compared to the parents? Could you not argue that whatever the parents teach the child are an even greater form of indoctrination?
You could, except that the thing is, the school, however great your school is, it's never going to love your child. The state is a bad parent. There are some really bad parents out there, obviously, but most parents are not the kind of parents where you take their children away. Most parents sort of do the best by their children in terms of their home life and raise them according to their values. Families, I mean, this is the irony. There's all this discussion about, the diversity of families and everything. But the point is that families, in terms of what they do on an everyday level, are always very diverse. They just do kind of different things. And children rebel against the values of their parents often, or take them on board by coming into contact with the world, through school and everything.
And to play devil's advocate for someone that believes in a utopian nanny state, why is it that...
You don't really, do you?
No, I'm playing devil's advocate. Why is it that parents should be able to have that heavy hand in their child's upbringing more so than education, which is formed by the state? Aren't they going to be biased emotionally? They're always going to think their kid is absolutely perfect because it's their kid. Would it not be better to use the state and this culmination of all these experts pulling policy data on what's most effective to teach kids? Would it not be better to give them the biggest hand in raising kids rather than the parents?
No, they should get lost. I mean, yeah, the point is that I don't think parents should really play that much of a role in education, you see. I think they should play a role in raising children. That's their main role. Education is something that a society does. And education is not what you're talking about. But that's an example of the blurring of the boundaries. If you're talking about education as the curriculum, it's like what a society decides is, the key English literature text that should be taught and why, the scientific methods, the importance of maths, all of these things.
Okay, well, what should the boundaries be? Where do you stop when you get into a school teaching kids personal development and skills for life? Where do you stop? Where does it go from education, something that should be taught just by your family and your upbringing?
Well, because if you ever say it out loud, you realise it seems stupid. I mean, skills for life, for example. Yeah, it's like, how are you going to teach those to a 14-year-old when you know that the world's going to change by the time they're grown up? It actually doesn't make sense. If you want to get kids to have financial literacy, for example, you teach them maths. That's what you do. I'm a big fan of the teaching of maths, largely because I'm not very good at it. So, the academic curriculum exists for a reason, in the sense that it's not only about passing on to children the cultural heritage of our society, which obviously we refresh as it goes on because our heritage changes and all of that kind of thing. But those subjects provide the skills to think, to question. My discipline, sociology, for example, which, I'm not saying it should be taught in schools, but, sociology is a critical discipline. Its very premise is to teach about society and then get people to kind of think critically about it. That's very different to a school teaching critical thinking skills. Do you see what I mean? I think there's this sort of, so there is a weirdness about the way that people think about what education is for, and that it provides the basis for kids to learn all of this other stuff. Sex and relationships education, it's like, teach them biology, and then kids, they learn some things from their families, and if the school doesn't like their family's values and tries to teach them something else, it doesn't change anything. So kids learn most about sex and relationships from their friends, and it's better to leave them alone to work it out, I would say. I could go on. Personal development, what's that mean? Well, what does it mean to you? I've got an A star in personal development. I mean, it's just bonkers, isn't it? That's not education.
I don't know that it is, and it feels like you're sort of categorizing personal development as inherently bad when actually maybe just the way it's taught at the moment is bad. But
no, I'm saying that it is something that should happen. The being at school, growing up, is personal development. The idea that it's something that can be taught.
Okay, well, let's scrap
social
personal development, but let's take something like sex and whatever other religions, whatever it's called, PSHE. There we go.
Yeah.
Is it not sort of a reactive approach rather than proactive to just let that sit with the person and their friends and family, and that's their idea of sex? Would it not be better to have certain things taught in schools about that?
Well, the trouble is, I've never seen a convincing kind of argument about how to do it or why to do it or how it should be done, because the problem when you bring in these things to a kind of a central curriculum is that it's always sort of politicized or moralized or whatever. I mean, I was at school during when AIDS broke out, right? And so there was a lot of fear. I mean, genuine fear about that. But then it was, I don't know if, whether you know, but in the 80s, it was then kind of heavily moralised by, for example, the government that, said, there's the big Tombstone adverts, and they were using the AIDS epidemic as a way of basically telling everybody, particularly young people, not to have casual sex. And then this became kind of into school. And, there was a moralising agenda. I mean, didn't he do, it scared us, right? But I don't think it was useful.
No.
I don't know if this is a particularly good example, but you can't have a one size. Oh, that's a terrible thing. I was going to say it anyway because it's probably quite funny. You can't have a one size fits all approach to sex. You can't. By its very nature, people have sex for different reasons at different times. Or what they need is the space, the privacy to be able to talk to each other. Oh, and trusted adults if they've got a problem. That's okay. But the idea of sitting in a classroom, I don't know how much has changed. Whether we're still in condom on a banana territory.
We are.
What's the point? What is it? Whoever puts a condom on a banana in real life?
Do you not?
Just getting a bit personal.
That's one of my hobbies. I'm insulted. No, but I think what you're touching on is teaching moral things, and I agree with you that you shouldn't be moralizing things in education to kids. But I was thinking about this the other day. Why the fuck was I taught for 3 years that there's chlorophyll in plants and how photosynthesis works, rather than skills that you can apply to anything in life and the world that I'm going to carry with me for the rest of my life, no matter what I go into? Why are we not taught that?
Well, because this is the stuff that you should learn. I mean, you spend a lot of your life at work. And the thing about practical skills, or vocational skills, or however you put them, is, I am not opposed to vocational education, particularly post-16. That's fine. But the skills that the kind of things that are useful on a job, first of all, ought to be taught by employers, actually. I mean, there's a long process where I think employers have kind of cast off their responsibility for training young people to schools and colleges. I think that's a mistake, and it's a problem on lots of levels, not least because it's really disrupted the kind of intergenerational transaction that used to happen in the workplace. If some old guy teaches you a trade, and you're having a breadth of experience there. Whereas if you're sat in a college with everyone the same age as you and no one's remotely interested, putting condoms on bananas, instead of learning bricklaying or something, I mean, it's not the same thing at all. So it should be done by employers, and also skills change. I mean, it's one of the big ironies, I think, at the moment that there's this sort of discussion about we need to use schools to teach kids the skills that they need for a changing world. Well, if the world is changing, what you teach them at 14 isn't going to be the same thing when they're 19. So the better question is, what can we give to children that will give them the strongest base for going forward and picking all of these things up? Now, you might not have any need for chlorophyll knowledge in the rest of your life, but you might be a biologist or a farmer. I mean, we don't know. But say you're a kid, you might go into something scientific, and that basis then allows you to build on that. And even if it doesn't, it's interesting. I know it doesn't feel like it when you're at school. But, what we do as societies to educate children is, I mean, it's a real kind of privilege. It's how childhood, or one of the key ways in which childhood is constructed as a special space in society. And that's why, for example, societies in the global south, where education is really quite difficult to get and everything else, and families will go to enormous lengths to educate their children. And it's not just so they can go and get a decent job somewhere in the world. It's because they know that this is part of what makes us kind of human and civilized, and it's the philosopher Hannah Arendt put it in terms of, it shows how much we love our children, that we are prepared to, I'm paraphrasing, that we educate them rather than just basically throwing them into the world and saying, right, see how you get on. So making you reinvent the wheel time and time and time again, because no one's ever taught you about how the wheel was invented. And it's also about expressing how much we love the world, that we care that all our past achievements are going to live on through the younger generation. I mean, imagine we just said, oh, well, all we need from today's youth is, we need them to be able to, I don't know, what do we need them to be able to do? Build solar parks, for example. This seems to be a thing at the moment. So we're going to teach them all these useful skills to build solar parks. I mean, what a terrible, terrible thing to do to children. What a deadening, impulse that would be.
Mm. Whereas teaching them that sometimes we map on logic to things just to convince ourselves of what we believe, complex topics like that, I think would be incredibly useful to learn about and discuss and debate in class. But I've never had that. I've had to seek that out myself through YouTube and philosophy videos and self-help videos and whatever else. And I wonder if that's not taught because people don't think it's useful, or if it's because it's too complex and it's not convenient. It doesn't stick to the current factory model we have in education.
I don't know. I mean, some of these things, I'm not saying that the curriculum is perfect, so there are things where you could say, well, this, I mean, I'm worried, for example, that, about the way that languages and, arts sort of, creative subjects are kind of being diminished at school level. I think that doesn't, lead to the best rounded education. But I'm also particularly worried about, higher education level, that sort of higher order of thinking that you're thinking about. It's like, well, that's what universities were for. And yet now, if you look at the discussions that are happening in higher education, it's all about, well, we need to do more to boost their employability skills. We say to students who are already working like 20 shifts at Tesco's to pay off their bloody student loans. I mean, it's a nonsense. So I think we are, as a society, we're in danger of depriving our youth of the basic academic knowledge, but also the ability to do all of that kind of higher level stuff that you're talking about. I mean, the existence, the fact that there are philosophy videos and all of this, I mean, is a great resource actually that your generation has now. And
Definitely.
If you're an autodidact, you can pull on that knowledge, and I think that's all terrific. So it's not all bad.
How do you see this playing out going forward? Because obviously the buzzword for 2024 was AI, 2 letters.
Yeah.
And I see it being very dangerous for how schools are constructed at the moment, where most of my memories of school and being in lessons is getting something on the whiteboard and having a teacher explain it and then writing it down and being able to recall that information in a test. Going to a math lesson, trying to work things out for yourself, and a calculator explicitly being banned in that paper. All these things that everyone uses the second they step foot out of that building. So what I fear is that we're being taught how to memorize things and copy information and recite it, when that's probably the thing that AI is best at and will most easily replace humans at doing.
Yeah, I think you're in danger of repeating what I like to call the AI fallacy.
What's that?
This idea that AI provides the knowledge and what we need are the codes to decipher it, the critical thinking skills. This is what a lot of people are saying in education. The problem with AI is it's fundamentally stupid. It doesn't know anything. And actually, in terms of there's potential with AI and there's pitfalls with it as well. But if we want to be able to use AI properly, actually, we've got to be able to know what to trust. And that's why I think we do need to start with the building blocks. Again, I think, it's like if you learn maths, I mean, frankly, this isn't a new problem, right? So just to use a self-deprecating example, like I say, maths isn't my favourite. I did quite well in maths. I'm not totally useless at it. But, I don't, if there's an opportunity to do a sum, online. I mean, I now just type it into Google. I do that and I realise that I've got very lazy, that rather than do the struggle with mental arithmetic, I'll just type it into Google. Now, the thing is, I sometimes come up with a number. My husband's a former math teacher, and I'd say, it's this number. And he'd go, how could it be that number? Because, I'd not really been paying attention. You come up with a stupid number, right? Whereas if you knew the maths, you might not be able to do the sum in your head, but you would know approximately what you were looking for. So if you got the decimal point in the wrong place, you would know that it was wrong. And it's the same with, language is more my thing, it's the same with words, you might not know exactly how to spell them, but you can broadly tell if they look right. Now, I think this is the the stuff with AI, you kind of need to know what's plausible,
Well,
which means you need the discipline.
I think this hits on exactly what I'm saying, which is that you need to know the process and why things are the way they are, rather than just copying a formula. This is how you work this out in your maths lesson. There's not really an explanation of why the rules of maths or whatever else that actually mean that you use that process and get to that sum. It's more just copy this method and it will always give you the right answer. Copy this writing and it will give you the best result in the exam. Whereas what I'm saying is that I think that is what AI can do. I agree with you. It doesn't have that deeper understanding and it is stupid. But in terms of just reciting information, recalling information, I feel like that's what I was taught a lot of the time in education. And, that's going to be gone in an instant, the use for that.
Yeah, well, look, I agree with you to the point that I think, like I said, the curriculum's not perfect. Forms of teaching aren't always perfect. There are more creative things that we could be doing. This whole question of pedagogy, is a long-standing question amongst educationists, how you get students to where they need to be, and recognising that students start in a variety of places. And I think learning methods of things is good. It's better than what I've heard teachers call kind of recipe learning, where you just do this. That's terrible. That's a complete failure. And I would say, in maths or, in English, grammar, I think is really important. When I was at school, we never learned grammar. It was very anti-grammar time. Doing words, being words and describing words, and that was it. And I learned all my grammar through doing A-level French. Anyway, bizarrely. So I'm a big fan of teaching grammar as a way of working out that process of kind of how you think and all of that. But somehow the way that seems to be applied in schools, particularly primary schools, is in this weird sort of pseudo-linguistics type way. It isn't really about helping children make sense of the world. So I'm not trying to say it's all perfect, leave it alone. But I think with AI, I think we have to be very careful not to get too excited or too terrified about its implications for education. My fear is that there's a push in the direction of let's all roll over in the face of AI and say, AI can do that, so why bother teaching this? Or let the machine do it. And again, I think we saw the precursor to this in COVID, this idea that, we can just teach them online. No, you can't. I mean, you can teach online, but not just like that. It's a very specialised thing. It's a very different way of doing things. Certainly doesn't work with 7-year-olds.
Okay, this is all very neatly tied back to Gen Z, which is the final generation we'll go for today. Biggest misconceptions.
Biggest misconception about Gen Z is that it's already been worked out. That it's got set characteristics or experiences, where the point, as I was saying earlier, Gen Z has not yet found its voice. A lot of you are still very young. And as I said, I'm in a way quite excited to see what Gen Z will become, because I think you are the product of a very peculiar historical moment. And I'm looking forward to see how it works out. But we can't script that in advance. And to try and do so is both arrogant and patronising and, there's lots of things. It's over-deterministic. Yeah.
How do generations change and the gap between them through history? If we maybe go back even further, are there more defined groups? I mean, there are boomers that are alive now, obviously, and they're 3-4 generations back from me. What was it like in a time that was less busy, like the Dark Ages, where there wasn't World War I, World War II, the post-war boom, the sexual revolution, COVID, whatever else? Would it be right to even categorize each generation as a generation, or would you sort of lump maybe 3 lines and descendants down into one generation because things were happening slower and they were more similar?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very it's a very interesting question. I did write about this in one of my books. I'm trying to, yeah, in the sense that generational thought has got a very long history, goes back to the Greeks and all of that. So you have discussions about generations and ideas about generations at various points in history. But the particular way in which we think about social generations is very much tied to industrial society. That notion that we have like periods of like just 15, 20 years and, and it becomes a way of, there's been a long-standing kind of confusion about the way that these generational shifts kind of express changes or whether they cause changes or whatever. I mean, I think as much as possible, we should avoid the sort of slice and dice approach to understanding society. I think if we understand history properly, including recent history, we can understand time. And if we understand people's relationship with their historical moment, that really tells us what we need to know about generations.
Is there are there many profound things to say about the origins of the idea of generations in the ancient Greek times?
I'm sure there are. But
or even just how they develop over history throughout the centuries.
Yeah, I think they was sort of what I was saying before. The ideas about generations, they express changes in the form of kind of history, and they're also about who's writing. We shouldn't forget that as well. That even these modern ideas of generations we've got, they're it's often they're sort of like middle class cultural sensibilities that capture the zeitgeist. That doesn't mean they're invalid. But it's not like a whole cohort experience. And, going back over time, I mean, there's loads of interesting things. I didn't mean to kind of dismiss what you said about the Greeks. It's just, I was like, whoa, it's a whole area. But, it tells us a lot about, the relationship between man and nature, individual and society, the construction of childhood, and how that emerged and changed and has changed over time. The meaning of adulthood, which is the flip side to the construction of childhood, citizenship, all of that stuff is bound up with it.
So can you imagine a future in, say, 300 years' time where actually it's not wound up in this very emotive process of attributing a generation label to people? Can you imagine 300 years' time, historians and sociologists will look back on this period and maybe actually alter the definitions of generations and sort of lump Gen Z and is it Gen Alpha that come after us?
Allegedly, just because it comes after Z. Go figure.
There we go.
Profound.
Do you think there would be an alteration of the way generations are looked back on?
Possibly. I think the further you get away from historical moments, from epochs, you get sort of more clarity. And I think as I talk about the interwar period, for example, I think maybe there'll be a discussion in the future of the period of time between the end of the Second World War and whether it's the next war or the pandemic or there'll be something that defines an epoch. So that side of things I think will become possibly better understood. But I think important aspect of a society's history is the stories it tells itself. And this whole way in which we categorise generations are the stories we're telling ourselves about change and, who we are at particular times and stuff. So I'd hope it doesn't all get forgotten. But I do hope it becomes discussed a bit more critically. I mean, I was very heartened, I think it was a couple of years ago, that the Pew Research Institute, I think it's called, in America, has done a lot of really influential stuff on generations. But it was responding to a letter by a bunch of social scientists who were saying, can you stop using the category of generations because it's just becoming ridiculous and divisive and blah, blah, blah. And Pew said, yeah, actually, we're going to stop using these labels because they've become so overused and abused. It's clouding our ability to use it as a proper social scientific tool to see what distinctions are. So, I think that is all underway, actually, in terms of pulling back from some of the excesses of generation chatter and just trying to say, look, what is it actually that we're talking about?
Dr. Jennie Bristow, thank you so much for coming on The Next Generation. Where can people find your work if they want to see some more?
You can look at my website, which is jbristow.co.uk. So fairly straightforward. Thank you, Elliot. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.